So welcome, everyone. We're very pleased to have you join us for this discussion of an issue, genocide, that has scarred the modern era from the Holocaust to the present. I'm Alok Yadav, Associate Professor in the English Department at George Mason University and Director of the university's Center for Humanities Research. The CHR seeks to support, enrich, and raise the profile of humanities scholarship at the university and for the wider community. We organize our activities each year around an annual theme, and this year's theme is Humanity and Its Others. This event today has obvious resonances with the theme, and we're very pleased to be hosting it. I'd like to thank the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. for sponsoring the event and making it possible, and also the Departments of History and Art History and of Modern and Classical Languages here at Mason for their sponsorship and support as well. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator and the person who pulled the event together, Samuel Huneke, Associate Professor of History at George Mason University. A scholar of 20th century Germany, Sam is the author of States of Liberation, Gay Men Between Dictatorship and Democracy in Cold War Germany, and of A Queer Theory of the State. And most recently, he is the co-editor of Reimagining Citizenship in Post-War Europe. And now I'll turn it over to Sam to introduce the event itself and our speakers.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alok, so much for that lovely introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for sitting through these technical issues with us. We're really delighted to have you here today to listen to this really wonderful panel. In addition to Alok and the center, I'd also like to thank the center's Associate Director, Catherine Olian, who couldn't be here today, who did a lot to make this event happen. Just quickly, the event is being recorded, and if there's time for Q&A afterwards, which I hope there will be, that will be something where we invite all of you to use the Q&A function to submit questions, which I will then relay to our panelists. Quickly, before we jump in, I'd like to introduce our two panelists. First, we have Omer Bartov, who is the Samuel Pizar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. Educated at Tel Aviv University and St. Antony's College, Oxford, he's written widely on war crimes, interethnic relations, and genocide. His recent books include Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach, which won the National Jewish Book Award, Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Galician Past, and Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis. Bartov's essays and commentaries on the current crisis in the Middle East have been featured in many national and international outlets. He is currently engaged in two book projects tentatively titled Israel, What Went Wrong, and The Broken Promise, A Personal Political History of Israel and Palestine. His novel, The Butterfly and the Axe, was published last year in the United States and Israel. Then we have Andrew Port, who is Professor of History at Wayne State University in Detroit. He is the author of Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust, Conflict and Stability in the German Democratic Republic, and Becoming East German, Structures and Sensibilities After Hitler. Port grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and received degrees in history from Yale and Harvard. He is the recipient of the DAAD Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in German and European Studies, and served for 5 years as editor-in-chief of the journal Central European History. And just as a personal note, I want to add that these are both scholars who I have admired and have really grown from their scholarship for many years now. So I'm excited to have them here. So just as a brief word of introduction to what we'll be talking about today. It's a commonplace today to assume that the Holocaust, the systematic murder of over 6 million Jews by the National Socialist government of Germany, as well as its allies, occupies a central place in our morality today. International norms and international laws were built after the end of the Second World War to ensure that never again would nations simply sit back as such atrocities were committed. In the aftermath of the Cold War, memorialization of the Holocaust took off, with new monuments and museums being founded and erected around the globe. We're all too used to comparing our political foes as well to Nazis and programs we find abhorrent to their policies. But the way that the Holocaust fits into our contemporary understandings of politics, law, and morality have never been simple, nor have they been uncontested. The fissures in Holocaust memory that have been all too apparent in the war that Israel has waged in the Gaza Strip ever since the Hamas attack of October 7th of last year point to these, the contested nature of Holocaust memory. So I'd like to pose a sort of introductory question to both of our panelists. You're both historians of Germany, and you've both written about the Holocaust and its impact on the post-1945 world. How would you describe the evolution of Holocaust memory since the end of the Second World War? How has Holocaust memory, in your view, been entangled in post-war efforts to hold perpetrators of the Holocaust accountable for their crimes? And either one of you can start.
Can I? Omar, you certainly can. I just have a kind of a
Please.
prepared. So is that okay?
Yeah,
First of
of
all,
course.
Sam, thank you. You still hear me, everyone? Still good?
Yep.
Good. All right. First of all, Sam, thanks so much for inviting me. When did we meet? About 5 or 6 years ago at the Transatlantic Seminar, right, in Berkeley? Yeah, so it's good to see you again. Omar, it's good to see you again as well. I've been reading and admiring your work since I was in graduate school. And to prepare for today, I read through a lot of your recent publications and I don't agree with everything you say, but what I really appreciate is just how balanced you try to be and just how much expertise you bring to the table here. So let me let me talk a bit about this question of how Holocaust memory has evolved. Obviously, it's too broad a question to answer really comprehensively. So instead, I want to just offer some general observations. First, it's important to differentiate between post-war memory of the Nazi period of the Third Reich in general, and a more specific discussion of the final solution. And I think the failure to do that has led to really a good deal of confusion about German efforts to reckon with the past, with Vergangenheitsbewältigung, that unwieldy German term. So confusion about German efforts to reckon with the past, how that changed over time. Second, we need to differentiate between memory work in East Germany and West Germany. Now, public and scholarly preoccupation with the genocide of the Jews really starts in the late 70s in West Germany. And I would argue that it never really took shape in the GDR in East Germany. It wasn't ignored, but really nothing comparable to what you had in West Germany starting in the 60s and especially the 70s. Some of you may be familiar with Susan Neiman's book, Learning from the Germans. She has, I think, a very strange chapter 3 where she claims that the East Germans did more to commemorate the Holocaust than the West Germans did, which is very strange because it comes after 2 chapters in which she talks about all the work that the West Germans did to commemorate the Holocaust. But I guess that's the danger of letting your politics color your analysis. At any rate, there's a popular misperception that most Germans were silent about and repressed memories of Nazism right after the war, and that the Third Reich remained a taboo topic until the late 1960s, when all of a sudden progressive German youths in West Germany suddenly rediscovered the horrors of the 30s and 40s and condemned the criminal and moral failings of their elders. It's not wrong, but it's also misleading, I think, because the baggage of the Nazi past was always somehow present in both German states after the war. I'm thinking here of early efforts to eliminate aspects of the Nazi past by doing away with institutions and structures that had supposedly paved the way to dictatorship and war and genocide. And in that sense, almost every feature of public and private life during the early post-war period was an indirect or direct, more so indirect reckoning with the tumultuous Nazi years. And the best example of that are the new constitutions, the content of the new constitutions that each state adopted. I guess my larger point is that mastering the past didn't just mean confronting the Holocaust. Now, that said, there was indeed a tendency early on to forego an open reckoning with German crimes, especially against the Jews. Instead, the Germans adopted a pragmatic, self-exculpatory approach with an emphasis more on German suffering. And there were many reasons for that, including the dictates of the Cold War and the need to reintegrate millions of Nazis into West German society. But as I'm sure most of you know, Nazi atrocities and the Holocaust, they eventually took center stage starting in the late 50s and early 60s, partly in response to a disturbing wave of openly anti-Semitic activity at that time in the Federal Republic. This led to the first major war crimes trial in West Germany in 1958 in Ulm, and it led to the establishment of the Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in the city of Ludwigsburg near Stuttgart. The real turning point, of course, was the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem and the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of the early and mid 60s. And for the first time, the genocide of the Jews really took center stage. This was also the period when, for example, Germans started to organize school visits to concentration camps and also to Israel. Now, the shift I've been describing, it culminated in 1968 when West German youth, the 68 generation, confronted elders for not doing more to stop, or even worse, for having abetted Hitler. And then they added insult to injury by sweeping the past under the rug after the war. Well, that more critical turn, it didn't appear out of nowhere, as I just tried to make clear with the earlier developments I was describing. But a crucial and overlooked point is this, and the first time I ever heard this argument was from Raoul Hilberg, who said that that even in 1968, the focus wasn't on the genocide of the Jews per se, except when the extreme left depicted themselves as quote unquote the new Jews, right? The RAF referred to their Sonderbehandlung, their special treatment, a Nazi term. They referred to their imprisonment in imaginary gas chambers. Now, inflated rhetoric like that and careless invocations of Auschwitz are and were deeply problematic because I think they led to a trivialization. Nevertheless, 68 marked an important turning point. It's when the moderate leftist Willy Brandt became chancellor in 69, and West German officials now acknowledged and accepted more openly German responsibility for past crimes. And the upshot was a major shift in public awareness and acknowledgement of Nazi criminality. Memorials and monuments proliferated, but the genocide of the Jews really wasn't still a major focus. And I'll give you one example. Helmut Schmidt is the first West German chancellor to visit Auschwitz in 1977. He holds an impromptu talk, doesn't mention the Jews once. Instead, he refers to the Germans as Hitler's quote unquote first victims. Final point, the absences in Schmidt's speech really would have been inconceivable 2 years later, following the airing of the American miniseries Holocaust on West German TV in January 79, which was watched by millions, tens of millions of Germans. It was a major media event that dramatically changed how officials and ordinary West Germans reckoned with the Holocaust. They didn't suddenly discover the final solution that year, but the miniseries ushered in a new level of awareness, a more emotional, personal connection to something that was now seen as the seminal event of the 20th century, as the essence of German history. And ever since, and this would be my very last point, ever since, as anyone who's spent time in Germany since the 80s knows, the Holocaust has been the focal point of public discourse and official memory work about the Third Reich ever since. Okay, thank you. I will end there. Thank you for your patience. I hope you weren't going to say the same thing, Omer.
No. Well, I mean, there will be some overlap. So first of all, hi, everyone. And thanks, Sam, for hosting us. And it's good to see you, Andrew. I was just at your university the other day at Wayne State.
I knew you were Ferndale.
Yeah, a few days ago. First time. So now I know it. So I want to raise a few issues. We can probably develop them later, but I'll just mention them more briefly now. The first is that after World War II, there's a particular slogan that everybody uses, and various monuments are put up that carry that slogan in a variety of languages, which is never again. Jamais plus, ni wieder, and so forth. And I've written a fair amount about this in the last year, but what I want to mention here now, which is relevant both when we speak about Germany and speak generally about how the Holocaust comes into to play a much more central role in people's consciousness and in politics of memory, but also in reference to what we are seeing happening now in the Middle East, is that this slogan means different things to different people at different times. It sounds transparent, never again. What should never again happen? Well, what should never again happen is the Holocaust. But the never again syndrome, as I called it, is a bit more complex because obviously the Holocaust already happened when these slogans came up. It was over. So to pledge that the Holocaust would never happen again was a kind of cheap pledge because It happened, it was over, and that particular Holocaust was not about to happen again. The other way of thinking about never again, which was what in large part was adopted by Israel in the immediate aftermath of the war and then institutionalized with the creation of Yad Vashem, then obviously, as Andrew mentioned, with the Eichmann trial, but becomes much more important in Israel only since the 1980s, is never again any genocide of the Jews. So the second way of thinking about it is this is a pledge that Jews will be forever safe from genocide. And then there's the third option, which quite a number of the most prominent Holocaust survivors had spoken about, people like Primo Levi and Jana Meri, which is never again genocide. There should never be any genocide of any group. This idea of that there would never be genocide again, that, as I said, I mean, there were many voices in the aftermath of World War II that spoke about that. And it was, in fact, then made into law by the Genocide Convention of 1948, which is very much a response to the genocide of the Jews, but does not prohibit the genocide of the Jews that already happened, but prohibits any other genocide and tries to define what it is. That's, of course, a pledge that was never kept because there were multiple genocides after 1945. So these are the sort of three levels. First of all, when we talk about the Holocaust, are we talking about the Holocaust as a distinct event? Are we talking about it as being part of a larger phenomenon of genocide, of which it was part, had distinct features, but at the same time had much in common with other cases of genocide, and in fact was, I would say, both the major legitimizing international reason for support for the creation of the State of Israel, and was the major impetus for the agreement on the Genocide Convention. So this is one thing I think that we want to keep in mind. The second is, so when does the Holocaust really become a central issue in Germany and in other places? I can say, I came to Germany for the first time, to the Goethe Institute, in 1979. In 1979, the Holocaust was not really a major topic in Germany. And if you were to look at the textbook that we had as students at the Goethe Institute in Murnau, at the time, there was one paragraph that spoke about Judenverfolgung, about the persecution of the Jews. And the photograph that came along with it was a photograph of Cologne having been destroyed and only the cathedral standing out from among the debris. How that connected to the persecution of the Jews was not explained in that text. And if you go and look back at history books, military histories, and so forth, the Holocaust was not a major topic. It moves into centrality in the 1980s and 90s, and it sort of consolidated as such in 2000 with the Stockholm meeting, and among other things, the vow that countries from Eastern Europe wanting to join the EU would have to remember and commemorate the Holocaust, which becomes a bit of a problem because they were actually involved in a variety of ways in the murder of the Jews. So it's a very long process. It's a long process in Germany. It's a long process elsewhere. And I would say to the topic of what is happening right now in the Middle East, it's also a long process in Israel. And I want to say here that, interestingly, what I mentioned before, that never again syndrome, in Germany and in Israel is especially interesting, because I would say that when we talk about German politics today, we can say that that extremely laudable process of German coming to terms with the past, which was carried out in large part by people of my generation in Germany historians, school teachers, and so forth, starting in the 1980s, against a whole lot of resistance. It was not easy to do it. That process at some point started showing that there was also a price to be paid by making the Holocaust so central to German identity and politics, by making it into Germany's Staatsräson. Why? In brief, I would say it set limits both on German domestic policies and on German foreign policies. German domestic policies in terms of integration of other people into Germany, of people first when Czechs become finally German citizens after reunification, and later on the arrival of, the arrival of large numbers of Muslim populations into Germany, especially in the wake of or during the Syrian civil war. Because the idea is that if you want to integrate as a good German citizen, you have to take upon yourself the burdens of the German past. But the main burden of the German past, you want to be part of the country of Schiller and Goethe, it has to be also Hitler, and especially the genocide of the Jews. And that is, of course, for people coming from Muslim countries, especially people who've had opinions about Israel and the Palestinians, is not an easy thing to do. And those limits are and those problems are very evident in contemporary Germany right now. It also sets limits, of course, on German foreign policy, both vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and German difficulty in deciding how and to what extent to support Ukraine, saying, well, we wreaked so much damage on Russia, of course, also on Ukraine. In World War II, how can we supply arms against the Russians now? And most importantly, vis-a-vis Israel, of course. And the great difficulty that German policymakers are having in condemning what they see happening, especially in Gaza. So that's on the German side, that this process of coming to terms with the past is not the sort of only a great progressive move, but has all kinds of limits that have to be recognized. I'm not saying that there's an easy way out of it, but I'm just saying we need to recognize that. In Israel, centralizing the Holocaust, that sort of never again syndrome had major impacts, starting really, it's true, the Eichmann trial is important, but the Eichmann trial is not really the beginning of the process in Israel itself. I would say that the War of 73, the rise to the right in Israel of the Likud party in 77 under Menachem Begin, and then mostly in the 1980s, the state of Israel starts thinking about the Holocaust as an organizing principle of Jewish Israeli identity. It solidifies society around one idea, an idea that in the past we were all either targeted or ancestors were, or we might have been, had the Germans arrived there, say in North Africa or in the Middle East. So it sort of organizes society around this idea of real and potential persecution in the past, but also of potential catastrophe in the future. And it brings together Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, secular and religious, young and old. We are all organized around that principle of the past Holocaust and potential future genocide. And that has all kinds of expressions in Israeli politics that we can go into. It also, however, strangely creates a sense of great fragility, because if you're organizing your state around the idea that you might at any point in the future be destroyed, the country that was supposed to have been a safe haven for Jews after the Holocaust is the country most threatened by another Holocaust, then there is a potential there of always feeling vulnerable and therefore lashing out against any real or potential or imagined existential threat. So you're living in a state of constant fear of that happening again. And often this can distort your understanding of reality. So whereas in Germany, the sort of distortion is not so much distortion of reality, but a sense of a moral burden, in Israel, it's a sense of existential fear. And then I want to say one last thing that also connects between coming to terms with the past and the present time. So you may know that my own early research was about the Wehrmacht and its war on the Eastern Front. And at the time, this was really a taboo topic in Germany. There were a couple of German historians who started writing about this in the 1970s, and I wrote my dissertation in the early 1980s, and then wrote 2 books on this, and argued, of course, that the German army was deeply involved in mass crimes in the Soviet Union, and that the soldiers who were carrying out these crimes were not people in the back, in the rear, but the fighting units, and that they were acting in part also because of the kind of socialization, education, and indoctrination that they received as young men growing up in Germany in the 1930s, and targeted indoctrination as troops in the German military. And that in many ways, that distorted their understanding of what they were doing. So it's not just that they were killing Slavs and Jews because they were Untermenschen, they were subhumans, or that they were Judeo-Bolsheviks. They were doing it out of a sense of both victimhood and fear of retribution. And the sense of victimhood had to do with the fact that these were people associated with the defeat of Germany in World War I, those who had stabbed Germany in the back. And therefore, one had to ensure that that would not happen again. And a sense of fear of retribution because the very crimes that they were carrying out, they could imagine that that would happen to them were they to lose the war. And it appears in that discourse. So it showed in many ways that this kind of discourse of victimhood has its own powerful, violent potential. Now, when I spoke about that in the 1980s in Germany, it was very, very hard for Germans to accept that the Wehrmacht was actually a criminal organization engaged in mass crimes. And the reason was very simple, that the Wehrmacht represented much of German society. There were about 20 million men who went through the ranks of the Wehrmacht. And it took a long time, and you may remember that in the late 90s, there was a big debate over the exhibition crimes of the Wehrmacht in Germany, and the opposition to that was in large part because people, including members of parliament, who were crying, saying, "I can't believe that my father, was involved in that." And of course, not one's own father, but what about all the other fathers who might well have been? Now, the reason I mention this is that it shows the limits of coming to terms with the past. There are things that are easier to come to terms with than others. So yes, Germany said, we feel responsible or we regret the crimes that were carried out in the name of the German people, rather than saying the German people carried out these crimes. Or we say, yes, we recognize the Holocaust. It was carried out by, the SS and the Gestapo, and nobody had parents in the SS and the Gestapo. Or, well, I mean, the Wehrmacht was involved in killing 30 million Soviet citizens, and likely my father or uncle or grandfather were engaged in that undertaking. And that, when you think about that today, and I don't know if we're going to talk about it or not, is reflected, and I wrote a little bit about it, is reflected in the debate that is happening in Israel now about the complicity of Israeli soldiers in war crimes, killings, crimes against humanity in Gaza. It's extremely hard for people to accept that their own children, grandchildren, husbands, brothers are engaged in what they would condemn but cannot believe that people from their own families, from their own community would be engaged in.
Thank you. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Andrew, for those wonderful initial responses. You both have sort of, in various ways, hinted at this in those answers. But I want to ask a question about sort of how we think about the Holocaust today and the sort of contentiousness of Holocaust memory, both in Germany but also elsewhere. Especially in recent years, German historians have debated a huge amount about the place of Holocaust memory and Holocaust history, and whether it serves those same goals that it once did, that both Andrew and Omer, you both referred to in your answers. Some Holocaust historians, such as Dirk Moses, have asserted that in Germany, at any rate, Holocaust memory has ossified into a quote, catechism that prevents Germans from reckoning with other forms of oppression and racism. At the same time, other intellectuals have become much more pessimistic about the ability of us to, quote, learn anything from the Holocaust. As one example, the public intellectual in the US, Dara Horn, provocatively asked last year if Holocaust education was actually, quote, making anti-Semitism worse. These are just a few sort of riffs on a much richer and deeper debate in both the US and Germany. And I'm curious what your views are of those debates. Maybe Andrew, if you want to start.
Some of you know I've written at length about Dirk Moses's claims and the catechism debate. I don't know if I can do this, but I'd be happy to put in the chat for the people who are there a PDF or a link to this essay that I wrote called The Wrath of Moses. Instead of rehashing the arguments that I make there, I'd like to make one important point that I didn't stress clearly enough before. And it's this. My own book about German responses to genocide in other countries after 1945, book I just wrote last year, Never Again. As I said, it looks at German responses to genocide in other countries after the war, including the genocide of Bosnian Muslims during the Balkan Wars of the 90s. And my book demonstrates empirically that there really is little substance to Moses's claims. All the attention devoted to the Holocaust and the claims about its uniqueness did not desensitize Germans and others to atrocities being committed elsewhere. Many German politicians, diplomats, journalists, human rights activists, the famed ordinary Germans, they all invoke, not all, but many invoke the memories of the Holocaust to justify calls for military intervention, also on the part of Germans, to stop mass killing and rape, and also as a reason to take in refugees and provide humanitarian aid. And that was true also for the Cambodian genocide in the late 70s and the Rwandan genocide in the 90s. For all of the recent claims that the Germans are so anti-Muslim, let's not forget that Germany in the early 1990s took in more refugees from Bosnia than all the other states of Europe put together. Now, let me make another point. Moses's comments about the strictures supposedly imposed by some sort of official Holocaust catechism and his other claims that Israel and support for Israel are some sort of sacred cow. Well, they simply don't jibe with the extremely critical comments about Israel I've heard over the past 3.5 decades. I went to Germany, West Germany, and East Germany for the first time in late 1987. And I'm thinking of comments by ordinary Germans and also German officials, especially on the far left, but not just on the far left. And as far as ordinary Germans go, I remember being at a dance at University of Berkeley, Berkeley many years ago. And I was dancing with a German woman, and the topic, I don't know why this came up during a dance, but the topic of Israel came up. And she really kind of lost it. I remember her eyes like, glowing widely and telling me, what right do the Jews have to tell us about our past, given what they're doing to the Palestinians? So this idea that there's some sort of catechism, some sort of what the Germans call a Sprachregelung, PC, or I just don't buy it. Now, you also asked about the lessons of the Holocaust. And I just want to say a few things about that. I more or less agree with Peter Novick's comments in his book, The Holocaust in American Life, which looks at the evolution of public discourse in the US about the final solution after 45. I agree with Novick when he says there are no lessons, right? And when I say that, a popular book that came out in the late 80s comes to mind, right? And that book I received as a gift at graduation, college graduation. It was called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. That said, the Holocaust certainly provides us with important warnings and lessons about seemingly unfathomable historical processes. And I'm thinking of the fruitful intentionalist versus functionalist debate about the origins of the Holocaust. Last point is Holocaust education making anti-Semitism worse, which is a really perverse idea on the face of it. To me, it sounds more like a them problem, but okay. That said, I've noticed something disturbing since the late 80s, since going to Germany for the first time and all of my visits since. And that is a backlash against what's seen as quote unquote too much memory, too much discussion about the Holocaust, which of course is ironic after decades of silence. Since the 80s, the Holocaust, as I said before, has dominated public discourse in Germany. It's taught, as I've heard from many Germans, taught every year to German school children. And one can understand why young Germans at some point say, enough is enough. The problem, it seems to me, is not the fact that the Holocaust is a central focus of public discourse and that it's taught regularly in the schools, but it's the way Holocaust education is taught. Its ubiquitousness, the stubborn claims about uniqueness, the persistent whiff of moral superiority. This impression that the Jews are kind of, hogging all the attention, that's led to resentment and, yes, expressions of anti-Semitism on the part of other groups that have been persecuted in the past. African Americans, Greeks under Turkish rule, Germans because of their own suffering during, right, and after World War II. And I've heard comments from all groups, members of all those groups telling me that they're sick and tired of only hearing about the Jews. And that complaint then leads to anti-Semitic, or to use the new lingo, anti-Semitic adjacent musings about, supposed Jewish control of the media and of Hollywood. I'll end there.
Right. Yeah. So I agree with a lot of what Andrew was saying. I assume we're not talking only about Germany, right, Sam? This is good. So first of all, about the catechism thing, yeah, I also wrote about it at the time. There was an attempt to proclaim this as historischer Streit 0.2, which it wasn't. And I don't think that we want to spend too much time on that. I would say that at the time, what interested me much more was the book that was published by Dirk Moses, which is a long book that he worked on for a long time, The Problems of Genocide. And without going into a huge amount of details on that book and what he tries to say, the one thing that I found disturbing about it was the idea that he had actually been writing about already 20 years earlier, but sort of eventuated in this book, that the focus on the Holocaust, the growing focus on the Holocaust, made it very difficult to speak about other genocides, because no genocide could measure up to the Holocaust. In the book, he also creates a kind of strange argument that the people who were promoting the Genocide Convention, most prominently, of course, Raphael Lemkin, were doing that in large part to make it equivalent to the Holocaust. and to cover up for the crimes or for the actions of Israel already then. That is, we're talking about 1948, and we're talking about the Nakba. And so the way they're defining genocide is done to make it like the Holocaust and unlike any other genocide. And that's a very strange argument for a variety of reasons I won't go into, but the definition of genocide by the UN Convention is anything but that. So I think it's important to think, if we are talking about Holocaust memory and we are talking about lessons of the Holocaust, to think what is the relationship between the Holocaust as a particular event and genocide as a generic phenomenon, of which there have been plenty before and after the Holocaust. And much of the debate for a long time, between scholars of the Holocaust and scholars of genocide, and comparative genocide, has been over that. As Andrew was saying, among other things, the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Is the Holocaust another genocide that has unique aspects, or is it something onto itself, and you shouldn't compare it with anything? And I've spent a long time writing, although some people for some reason accuse me of saying that the Holocaust was unique, saying exactly the opposite for the last 30 years, that if we talk about any historical event as unique, then we are basically taking it out of history and propelling it into metaphysics. And that's a totally different thing. The Holocaust happened within a context, a historical context, and it can only be understood by comparing it to other events, including to other genocides. So I think that's one important issue when we talk about lessons of the Holocaust. What do we learn from the Holocaust? If we want to learn anything from the Holocaust, we have to think about it also as a genocide that has similarities with other genocides. And the book that I wrote on Buchach, on a local genocide, shows that there are many elements in the Holocaust, in local instances of the Holocaust, of which there were hundreds, of course, if not thousands, that are very similar to other genocides, such as what happened in Rwanda and in Bosnia in the 1990s. At the same time, I actually also wrote a sort of subchapter, I think in 2000, in Mirrors of Destruction, on that I called Lessons of the Holocaust. And I was just speaking before this meeting with another group of students here at Columbia. An idea developed that there are particular lessons of the Holocaust that we can impart, that we can teach the Holocaust for some reason to teach us humanity, to teach us intolerance, against tolerance, to bring up better human beings. And that I always found very strange, because why would you want to teach about some of the worst cases of hate and murder and intolerance? Why do you think that by teaching that, you're going to make the young students who are exposed to that into more tolerant people? Why would that be the conclusion? And it made me think that one can use the Holocaust, like any event, to teach totally different things. One can draw whatever lessons one likes. So in the US, a particular idea was created that you teach the Holocaust to teach tolerance. And in Israel, the Holocaust was taught to say we should never go like sheep to the slaughter. So in one place, you teach, well, now you should love your fellow man. And in the other place, now you should always carry a gun in case anybody wants to carry out genocide against you. It's the same event, and you're drawing totally different lessons from it. And within Israeli discourse, this came out very prominently in 1988 in an article by the historian and philosopher Yehuda Elkanah, who wrote during the first Intifada a very controversial article in Haaretz at the time. I think it came out in March 1988, called In Praise of Forgetting, where he said that the constant harping on the Holocaust in education of young Israelis gives them the sense that they have license to exert extreme violence on anyone who they feel is threatening them. And he was writing that within the context of, as you may remember, at the time, Prime Minister Rabin said you should break their arms and legs about Palestinian youth who were throwing rocks at heavily armed IDF troops, and many IDF troops took that literally and actually broke arms and legs. And Elkanah was saying, and he had the legitimacy to speak that way because he was a child survivor of the Holocaust, that is not why we should, or that is one consequence of this infatuation, this obsession with linking everything back to the Holocaust. You don't learn humanity from the Holocaust, whatever it is that you do learn, and you may learn many other lessons from it. So I think that is important. And Peter Novick also just came up a couple of hours ago and yesterday. His book, The Holocaust in America, I thought identified a problem that was coming into being then and has become much worse since. He did not like the idea that you created now, in terms of Jewish history, a Jewish identity built around the Holocaust. He thought that was not the best focus of identity that you could think of. You want to feel that you're part of Jewish history, learn Jewish history, learn Jewish religion, learn traditions. But why focus? It's a sort of cheap way of identifying yourself as a group by saying, okay, my parents or my grandparents were or might have been victims of the Holocaust, and that's who I am. There's no burden on you to do anything but to identify yourself as a victim. And he was saying that partly also because there was the beginning then of a discourse of victimhood, not only among Jews, but generally, that people identify themselves as victims of whatever it is, as an ethnic group, as a national group. And that, of course, gives you political capital and moral capital, because as a victim, you can claim to be different from others, certainly from those who did or potentially would victimize you. And in that sense, I think he identified an important problem that we are still seeing today. Now, the last thing I want to say on this is that on the question of anti-Semitism, so we often speak about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism as synonymous. It's obviously, anybody who's studied the Holocaust knows it's slightly more complicated than that. Not all countries that were anti-Semitic were about to carry out the Holocaust, and there were people who were engaged in the genocide of the Jews who were not particularly anti-Semitic. They had other reasons to engage in mass murder, not least getting promoted, gaining more power. But anti-Semitism has now sort of, I'd say, come back to public discussions, and often in ways that are both misleading and in fact may cause a rise in real anti-Semitism. And I find that really troubling. And I sometimes think that scholars like us and others who have actually studied the phenomenon should speak out more clearly about that. And that is that in the sort of protest movement against Israel's actions in Gaza, often the argument was made in order to shut down these protests that they were anti-Semitic. And in most cases, there was very little evidence of that. There was evidence of anti-Israeli sentiment, there was evidence of pro-Palestinian sentiment, there was often evidence of anti-Zionism, but there was no evidence of anti-Semitism unless you define anti-Semitism as being any of the above. That is, that if you're anti-Zionist, you are necessarily anti-Semitic, or if you carry a Palestinian flag, you must be anti-Semitic, or if you condemn Israeli actions in Gaza, you must be anti-Semitic. So there was this argument being made, which was meant to legitimize shutting down speech, shutting down protest. And I found that disturbing, first of all, because it was a false argument. And from my own evidence, and including personal engagement, I found very little evidence of real anti-Semitism. And I know many Jewish students who were involved in these protests who were anything but anti-Semitic, but also because of the consequences of this. And my fear was and remains that this misuse or abuse of anti-Semitism, similarly to the misuse and abuse of arguments about the Holocaust, saying what happened on October 7th was just like the Holocaust, saying the Hamas are just like the Nazis, all of that, this abuse of this terminology may actually open the path for real anti-Semitism. And that real anti-Semitism, historically, and I wonder what Andrew would think, doesn't come from the left. Genocidal anti-Semitism, true violent anti-Semitism, has come from the right. And it has come as part of this argument that the Jews control everything, that the Jews are behind financial policies, politics, wars, anything bad that happens to us, the Jews are behind that. And when you see the kind of shutting down of protests and the kind of disciplining of academics, of scholars, of students at universities, not to dare speak out against what they are appalled by Israeli actions, the argument is being made that this is happening because of pressure from Jewish interests. And that can lead to a rise in anti-Semitism from its real sources, from those sources of the right, from those sources of conspiracy theories that see Jews behind anything bad that happens to us, such as America spending huge amounts of capital on providing Israel with arms or sending its troops to never-ending wars.
Thank you. Thank you both for those very thoughtful responses. I think we have time for me to pose one more question, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for audience Q&A before we wrap up at 2:30. So I'm sure this is a question everyone has been waiting for and probably logged on to hear answered. As you're all aware, on October 7th of last year, the terrorist group Hamas broke through barriers that separate Gaza from Israel, killing around 1,200 people and kidnapping more than 200, of whom at least 100 are still hostages. In response, as we all know, Israel invaded Gaza. It's bombed over 40,000 sites in the 140 square mile strip, making Gaza one of the most bombed sites in history. Over 40,000 Gazans are estimated to have died, and hundreds of thousands more face what the UN has described as catastrophic levels of malnutrition and hunger. The conflict now seems to be spreading to the wider region. Over the last year, many have described October 7th as the largest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust and insisted that the Nazis' mass murder of Europe's Jews gives the Israeli Defense Force the moral high ground in its campaign to destroy Hamas. After the attack, the German government, for instance, projected "Never Again Is Now" onto the Brandenburg Gate in central Berlin underneath the Star of David, suggesting that the moral injunction to prevent genocide meant it was necessary to stand by Israel, as Omar has suggested earlier today. At the same time, critics of Israel have claimed the opposite, namely that the lessons of the Holocaust mandate standing with the Palestinian people, whom they understand to be victims of genocidal violence. These critics have even turned to some of the norms, laws, and institutions which arose because of the Holocaust to make their case. South Africa's government, for instance, recently brought suit against Israel in the International Court of Justice for allegedly committing crimes against humanity. As you've both mentioned, you've written and spoken extensively about this connection, especially in the last year, albeit with slightly different perspectives. And so to wrap up this conversation, I'm curious about your views on this issue. How does the Holocaust illuminate what is happening in Palestine today? Or if you think that it in fact doesn't, why do so many people think that it does? And maybe Andrew, do you want to start again?
Feel bad always starting. Wait, getting echo again. Can you hear me? Everything good? All right. Well, I would say that my one-word answer is no. The Holocaust does not illuminate in any way what's happening in Palestine today. And I can't really speak for those who think it does, but I imagine that the invocation of the Holocaust is motivated by a few reasons. First and foremost, the shock value. And then, it's an emotionally effective way to criticize Israel for its alleged hypocrisy, given the history of the Jewish people. In other words, it's kind of a tout quoque argument. Now, of course, it's not just Israel's critics who invoke the Holocaust in the most recent conflict. Israel's supporters do as well, as Omer just suggested, mainly, this is not something he mentioned, but, mainly by pointing out supposed continuities between anti-Semitic Nazi ideology and the aims and beliefs of Israel's main foes today. Just, look at the Hamas charter calling for the destruction of Israel. They also tend to emphasize the links between fascists and Arab leaders in the region going back to the 30s. And it's not wrong per se, but and I know at least one person who's sitting here listening to this is going to disagree with what I'm about to say, and I'll be getting an email in a second from him. But I think the aim here is also shock value. More important, such arguments, I think they're used unfairly to undermine the Palestinian cause and downplay Palestinian suffering as a whole. I'm not saying there aren't continuities, and I'm not saying that Hamas is not anti-Semitic, but I think we have to keep the two things somehow separated. Now, since my field of expertise is modern Germany, I want to say a few words about the German response to the current conflict. Omar already touched on this a bit, but the German response has attracted a great deal of criticism from many quarters, but especially on the left. And since last spring, I've been on this extended tour to promote my new book, Never Again, which, as I said, looks at German responses to genocide in other countries after 45. Interestingly enough, each time I speak, I'm invariably asked about German responses to Israel's alleged genocide against the Palestinians. Now, that was true before the Israeli military response to the Hamas attack of October 7th, but the question arises even more frequently since then, now with greater urgency and emotion, usually more an accusation than a question. And for all their talk of never again, I'm asked, why are Germans not coming out more forcefully on this issue by condemning Israeli action in Gaza and the West Bank as genocide? Now, many Germans are understandably wary to use that charged term when it comes to the Middle East conflict because of their own awful history, right? It's the same reason why German officials have kept a tight rein on certain types of pro-Palestinian demonstrations, even those involving Jewish critics of Israel. But don't Germans have a duty to call a duck, so to speak, even more so because of their past? And as I know from my own research, those who argued in favor of German participation in international military efforts to stop Serb carnage in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 90s, they used similar arguments. Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer famously used the phrase never again Auschwitz. His predecessor, Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel, said that Germany had a, quote, political and moral duty to assist precisely in light of our history. The larger point I guess I'm trying to make is that all of this puts Germans in an extremely difficult position. But I can still understand those who demand a more forceful response after seeing the horrific images from Gaza. I just remind them that politicians and diplomats can sometimes accomplish more acting behind the scenes because they understand the psychological role played by the need for government officials to save face. In this case, I'm thinking especially of Israeli government officials. What about critics of Germany who've made claims and generalizations about German authorities offering unconditional support to Israel or suppressing civil liberties by canceling all critics of Israel and cracking down on all forms of pro-Palestinian protest? Well, I think if you look at past and more recent statements by German officials about Israel, you'll realize how specious such arguments are. And the same is true of misleading claims about some sort of mass crackdown on pro-Palestinian protest in Germany. It depends on the behavior of the protesters and the tenor of the statements. And to my mind, German authorities, because of their past, and university administrators here in the US have every right to forbid demonstrations calling for violence or espousing clearly anti-Semitic and or anti-Muslim sentiments. In any event, and I'll close with this, Germans are finding themselves once again in this difficult position of being damned if they do and damned if they don't. You can only imagine the reaction from abroad and at home in Germany if German authorities were to look on passively as critics of Israel pass out baked goods in central Berlin to celebrate October 7th, which they did, or make blatantly anti-Semitic comments or call implicitly or explicitly for the destruction of Israel. And you can just go on YouTube and find many examples of that. And I'll stop there.
So this is a huge topic, and we don't have a huge amount of time. So I'll just try to say a few things. First, as I think Sam, you mentioned, so it's interesting and in some ways, of course, ironic that in 1948, the Genocide Convention came into force in large part in response to Nazi crimes and especially the genocide of the Jews. And so for the state of Israel today, less than 8 decades later, to be suspected of genocide or accused of genocide or found guilty of genocide, investigated for genocide, and certainly crimes against humanity and war crimes, a state that was founded in the wake of the Holocaust and legitimized as such because of the Holocaust is very hard to stomach. In Israel, people say, well, it's cynical and anti-Semitic. That's the general argument in Israel. And there are people who would say that in other parts of the world. And other people would say, well, the regime of international law that was put into place in the wake of World War II and Nazi crimes is now being threatened. That entire regime is being threatened by the impunity with which one state has been behaving now for a year without any censure and any stop, being supplied constantly with arms by its largest ally, but also by Germany, that provides between 30 and 20% of all arms supply to Israel. The Israeli Navy is mostly made by Siemens, which is an irony of its own. And if this continues, not only is there a question as to the actions of Israel, but it also creates an atmosphere in which other rogue states would say, well, what the hell? Why should we care about war crimes, crimes against humanity? Israel gets away with it. Who is to tell us not to do that? So it creates a situation of international chaos. And so this is the sort of framework, or one framework, I think, in which we need to think about it. The second is the sort of rhetorical one. So when people say something like October 7th is the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. Now, whether it is or it isn't, maybe is a bit moot, but it's a large number of civilians, about 900 or 800 civilians who were killed, plus 300 soldiers and 250 hostages. I mean, these are very large numbers. This was obviously a war crime, a crime against humanity. If you want to connect it to the Hamas Charter of 1988, it could be a genocidal crime. But to say this is the largest killing of Jews after the Holocaust, what matters in the statement is the word the Holocaust. Because it triggers immediately a whole set of emotions, certainly in Israel, among other Jewish communities, and in Germany, of course. So its immediate association is with the Nazis, and we all know what you need to do with the Nazis. You don't negotiate with the Nazis, you have to kill them. You have to destroy them. As one Israeli MK said, kill, kill, kill. You just have to kill them all. And as the president of Israel said, there are no uninvolved people. So it isn't just that Hamas are human animals, as they were described by various people with executive authority in Israel already on October 8th, but that there are no uninvolved people. That is, all the people in Gaza are complicit. And therefore, what do you do to them? You eradicate them, which is largely what is happening right now. So this association, and then, of course, if you look at the Israeli media, Hamas are constantly described as Nazis. No one is bothering to explain why the Hamas are Nazis. They're just called that. They tried initially to call them Al-Qaeda, but that didn't wash. But Nazis works really well. So it delegitimizes, it dehumanizes an entire group, not only Hamas, but by association, the entire population of Gaza. This is the exercise that is being carried out, and it's really important to understand it. Now, I've written about this. I tried to be as careful as I could in trying to define what is happening in Gaza. What is the IDF doing in Gaza? And November last year, I wrote in the New York Times that I was not convinced that this was genocide, that there were certainly crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, but I did not see sufficient evidence to show that you could connect the genocidal statements that had already been made by Israeli leaders with actions on the ground, which is what you need to do if you want to follow the definition of genocide. There is you have to show expressions of intent which were made, but you have to show that they're being implemented on the ground, and I was not convinced. By May 24, I did become convinced that this was, in fact, a genocidal action, which was geared not only to kill large numbers of people, not only to displace the population over and over again, but also to destroy everything that makes for a culture, for a society, systematically. Universities, hospitals, schools, mosques, museums, other public buildings, obviously housing and infrastructure. And that is happening right now. And we don't have time to talk too much about it. So how does, Sam asked, how does the Holocaust illuminate Gaza? I mean, as Andrew said, it doesn't, of course not. But the discourse on the Holocaust is central to what is happening. The way Israelis think about it, large numbers of Israelis, I can't say how many, but I think a majority of Israelis, how the Israeli media talks about it, how Israeli politicians talk about it, and how it is sold around the world. And I think the connection, if we speak about Germany, that connection that is being made, combined with, say, the German acceptance of the IHRA definition, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, restrictions that I have personally experienced on how you talk and how you're censored in Germany, intimidation of people in Germany, in public places to speak critically about Israel, including censorship. I mean, I was personally censored. I protested, and then that thing was remade, but things that I said were cut out of a recording of a meeting in Germany and then reinstalled only when I or someone else noticed it. And intimidation of people being afraid of speaking critically about Israel. That certainly connects, and it does connect with what we see now happening also in the United States. Now, I completely agree with Andrew that people who call for violence or use violent rhetoric or genocidal rhetoric, if you like, in protests, there should be action against that. Calling for violence is not acceptable, but condemning violence is. And when you say that condemning violence is violent, that speaking out against genocide is threatening, that calling a country that you may want to support for one reason or another a genocidal state is itself a violent statement, that confuses matters. And what it does eventually is give sanction to ongoing violence. And And it can be a difficult sort of balance. But right now, this balance is not met. And the proof in the pudding is that Israel is, in fact, continuing to act with total impunity, and that there have been no restrictions or no serious restrictions. The Germans apparently have started restricting supplies, but they don't quite want to admit it and so forth. But very little restrictions on Israeli actions at a time of extreme urgency and extreme violence. And that, I think, if we want to say there are lessons of the Holocaust, people working in Holocaust museums, Holocaust scholars, have always said the worst thing was that nobody spoke out, that everyone was silent, right? Why did people not speak out? And these same institutions and these same scholars, many of them, who have always said that about what happened in the Holocaust, are now silent and are not speaking out. And that silence is complicity.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you both, Andrew and Omer, for this incredibly stimulating conversation, and heavy as well. We have about 5 minutes, so I think if someone, I'm getting a few questions, so hang on, I'll look through the Q&A and choose one to pose as a sort of wrap up. This is sort of a good one. Someone is asking, how does the Holocaust's persecution of other groups beyond just Jews fit into how we sort of think about and remember the Holocaust today?
Well, look, I mean, I can say quickly that it's an interesting question in the sense that, as we know, other groups that were subjected to Nazi violence and that can be included in the Holocaust directly, such as the handicapped and the Roma, took a long time, much longer than the Jews, to be recognized. In part, of course, because these were groups that remained subjected to violence and exclusion long after the Holocaust, and in part because they didn't have people to speak out for them. And the Jews, though subjected to extreme violence, of course, on a much greater scale than these two other groups, also both those who survived and those who were in other parts of the world who had not been directly subjected to Nazi violence could speak out. And even before the Holocaust ended, already started collecting evidence and writing about the event so as to make sure that it remained written in history. And the Roma and the handicapped did not have that. And in a sense, because they did not have that, it was easier to continue subjecting them to exclusion, to the extent that Germany, from what I remember, Andrew can maybe remember better, after the fall of communism, there was an influx of Roma who were coming from Romania, and the German government sold them back to Romania. Basically paid the Romanian government money to take them back. And there was no problem. It didn't. Now, you couldn't do that with Jews in Germany, of course, but with the Roma, there was not much of a problem.
Yeah, in fact, I just take this off. I just wrote a reader report of an article that talks just about that. I don't know. I would say this, obviously, including these other groups. You mentioned too, I don't know if you mentioned homosexuals, I would add them as well. That's a really important corrective. And, you know, it's one that should have been there from the beginning. But, you know, let's not forget, for decades, no one really talked about what had happened to the Jews either. And you know, unfortunately, victim groups, and not just in Germany, but, you know, victim groups all over the world, you know, they see this, unfortunately, as a zero-sum game. And it's not a zero-sum game. I think that's kind of the point that, everyone doffs their cap to Michael Rothberg's multi-directional memory, and, fine. But I think that's true. Talking about these other atrocities should in no way detract from what happened to the Jews. And I don't think there should be much, discussion there. How it's actually changed the discourse, that I'd have to think more about.
Okay, well, we are out of time. Thank you both, Omar and Andrew, for this incredibly wonderful, stimulating discussion. I've gotten lots of messages already about how much the audience got out of it. So thank you both again. Apologies for the slight technical snafu at the beginning,
My
but I'm glad
fault.
it work. It happens. So yeah, thank you again, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good seeing you both. Thank you.
Bye.